Just getting Instagram going here. All right. Now we're rocking. Hello, Haley. Hello, Alex. Grab your favorite drink, folks. Grab your favorite snack. And we're going to read some Anne. I'm just checking where we should read up to today. I've never had doll. It sounds delicious. Alright, well, why don't we commence to begin? Turn down the music here. Yep. Alright, it's time to start. In our previous edition, Uncle Abe, at the being impersonated by Observer, who happened to be Gilbert and Anne, had predicted a monster storm for the very day that it happened, with enormous hailstones and a sort of a storm of the century kind of storm that you don't see very often. And that has made, so Observer has made Uncle Abe's reputation. We also met Miss Lavender Lewis, who was just delightful, and Miss Lavender Lewis has met Paul Irving as well, which is rather interesting because she heard his dad, Stephen Irving, was an old flame of hers, and so there's some old romance there. Then let us carry on. Chapter 25, An Avonlea Scandal. One blithe June morning, a fortnight after Uncle Abe's storm, Anne came slowly through the Green Gables yard from the garden, carrying in her hands 2 blighted stalks of white narcissus. "Look, Marilla," she said sorrowfully, holding up the flowers before the eyes of a grim lady, with her hair coiffed in a green gingham apron, who was going into the house with a plucked chicken. "These are the only buds the storm spared, and even they are imperfect. I'm so sorry. I wanted some for Matthew's grave. He was always so fond of June lilies." "I kind of miss them myself," admitted Marilla, "though it doesn't seem right to lament over them when so many worse things have happened, all the crops destroyed as well as the fruit." "But people have sown their oats over again," said Anne comfortingly, "and Mr. Harrison says he thinks if we have a good summer, they'll come out all right, though late. And my annuals are all coming up again, but oh, nothing can replace the June lilies. Poor little Hester Gray will have none either. I went all the way back to her garden last night, but there wasn't one. I'm sure she'll miss them." "I don't think it's right for you to say such things, Anne. I really don't," said Marilla severely. "Hester Gray has been dead for 30 years, and her spirit is in heaven, I hope." "Yes, but I believe she loves and remembers her garden here still," said Anne. "I'm sure no matter how long I'd lived in heaven, I'd like to look down and see somebody putting flowers on my grave. If I had had a garden here like Hester Gray's, it would take me more than 30 years, even in heaven, to forget being homesick for it by spells. Well, don't let the twins hear you talking like that, was Marilla's feeble protest, as she carried her chicken into the house. Anne pinned her narcissi on her hair and went to the lane gate, where she stood for a while sunning herself in the June brightness, before going in to attend to her Saturday morning duties. The world was growing lovely again. Old Mother Nature was doing her best to remove the traces of the storm, and though she was not to succeed fully for many a moon, she was really accomplishing wonders. "I wish I could just be idle all day today," Anne told a bluebird who was singing and swinging on a willow bough, "but a schoolma'am who is also helping to bring up twins can't indulge in laziness, birdie. How sweet you are singing, little bird. You are just putting the feelings of my heart into song ever so much better than I could myself. Why, who is coming?" An express wagon was jolting up the lane, with 2 people on the front seat and a big trunk behind. When it drew near, Anne recognized the driver as the son of the station agent of Bright River, but his companion was a stranger, a scrap of a woman who sprang nimbly down at the gate almost before the horse came to a standstill. She was a very pretty little person, evidently nearer 50 than 40, but with rosy cheeks, sparkling black eyes, and shining black hair, surmounted by a wonderful beflowered and beplumed bonnet. In spite of having driven 8 miles over a dusty road, she was as neat as if she had just stepped out of the proverbial bandbox. "Is this where Mr. James A. Harrison lives?" she inquired briskly. "No, Mr. Harrison lives over there," said Anne, quite lost in astonishment. "Well, I did think this place seemed too tidy, much too tidy for James A. to be living here, unless he has greatly changed since I knew him," chirped the little lady. "Is it true that James A. is going to be married to some woman living in this settlement?" "No, oh no," cried Anne, flushing so guiltily that the stranger looked curiously at her, as if she half suspected her of matrimonial designs on Mr. Harrison. "But I saw it in an island paper," persisted the fair unknown. "A friend sent a marked copy to me. Friends are always so ready to do such things. James A.'s name was written in over New Citizen." "Oh, that note was only meant as a joke," gasped Anne. "Mr. Harrison has no intention of marrying anybody. I assure you he hasn't." "I'm very glad to hear it," said the rosy lady, climbing nimbly back to her seat in the wagon, "because he happens to be married already. I am his wife. Oh, you may well look surprised. I suppose he has been masquerading as a bachelor and breaking hearts right and left. Well, well, James A., nodding vigorously over the fields at the long white house, your fun is over. I am here, though I wouldn't have bothered coming if I hadn't thought you were up to some mischief. I suppose," turning to Anne, "that parrot of his is as profane as ever." "His parrot is dead, I think," gasped poor Anne, who couldn't have felt sure of her own name at that precise moment. Whew. Hello, welcome to the stream, at Tony Martinson. Glad to have you with us. We're reading Anne of Avonlea. "Dead. Everything will be all right then," cried the rosy lady jubilantly. "I can manage James A. if that bird is out of the way." With which cryptic utterance she went joyfully on her way, and Anne flew to the kitchen door to meet Marilla. "Anne, who was that woman?" "Marilla," said Anne solemnly, but with dancing eyes, "do I look as if I were crazy?" "Not more so than usual," said Marilla, with no thought of being sarcastic. "Well then, do you think I'm awake?" "Anne, what nonsense has gotten into you? Who was that woman, I say?" "Marilla, if I'm not crazy and not asleep, she can't be such stuff as dreams are made of. She must be real. Anyway, I'm sure I couldn't have imagined such a bonnet. She says she is Mr. Harrison's wife, Marilla." Marilla stared at her in turn. "His wife?" I may run out of battery on Instagram. I may take a little pause and then do some rearranging on Instagram so that I can save my battery and keep the stream going. "His wife? Anne Shirley, then what has he been passing himself off as an unmarried man for?" "I don't suppose he did, really," said Anne, trying to be just. He never said he wasn't married. People simply took it for granted. Oh, Marilla, what will Mrs. Lynde say to this?" They found out what Mrs. Lynde had to say when she came up that evening. Mrs. Lynde wasn't surprised. Mrs. Lynde had always expected something of the sort. Mrs. Lynde had known there was something about Mr. Harrison. "To think of his deserting his wife," she said indignantly. "It's like something you'd read of in the States. But who would expect such a thing to happen right here in Avonlea?" "But we don't know that he deserted her," protested Anne, determined to believe her friend innocent till he was proven guilty. "We don't know the rights of it at all." "Well, we soon will. I'm going straight over there," said Mrs. Lynde, who had never learned that there was such a word as delicacy in the dictionary. "I'm not supposed to know anything about her arrival, and Mr. Harrison was to bring some medicine for Thomas from Carmody today, so that will be a good excuse. I'll find out the whole story and come in and tell you on my way back." Mrs. Lynde rushed in where Anne had feared to tread. Nothing would have induced the latter to go over to the Harrison place, but she had her natural and proper share of curiosity, and she felt secretly glad that Mrs. Lynde was going to solve the mystery. She and Marilla waited expectantly for that good lady's return, but waited in vain. Mrs. Lynde did not revisit Green Gables that night. Davy, arriving home at 9 o'clock from the Bolter place, explained why. "I met Mrs. Lynde and some strange woman in the hollow," he said, "and gracious, how they were talking both at once. Mrs. Lynde says to tell you she was sorry it was too late to call tonight. And I'm awful hungry. We had tea at Milty's at 4, and I think Mrs. Bolter is real mean. She didn't give us any preserves or cake, and even the bread was scarce." "Anne, Davy, when you go visiting, you must never criticize anything you are given to eat," said Anne solemnly. "It is very bad manners." "All right, I'll only think of it," said Davy cheerfully. "Do give a fellow some supper, Anne." Anne looked at Marilla, who followed her into the pantry and shut the door cautiously. "You can give him some jam on his bread, Anne. I know what tea at Levi Bolter's is apt to be." Davy took his slice of bread and jam with a sigh. "It's a kind of a disappointing world after all," he remarked. "Milty has a cat that takes fits. She's took a fit regular every day for 3 weeks. Milty says it's awful fun to watch her. I went down today on purpose to see her have one, but the mean old thing wouldn't take a fit, and just kept healthy as healthy, though Milty and me hung round all the afternoon and waited. But never mind." Davy brightened up as the insidious comfort of the plum jam stole into his soul. "Maybe I'll see her in one sometime yet. It doesn't seem likely she'd stop having them all at once when she's been so in the habit of it, does it? This jam is awful nice." Davy had no sorrows that plum jam could not cure. Sunday proved so rainy that there was no stirring abroad, but by Monday everybody had heard some version of the Harrison story. The school buzzed with it, and Davy came home full of information. "Marilla, Mr. Harrison has a new wife. Well, not exactly new, but they've stopped being married for quite a spell, Milty says. I always supposed people had to keep on being married once they'd begun, but Milty says no, there's ways of stopping if you can't agree. Milty says one way is just to start off and leave your wife, and that's what Mr. Harrison did. Milty says Mr. Harrison left his wife because she throwed things at him, hard things. And Artie Sloane says it was because she wouldn't let him smoke, and Ned Clay says it was because she never let up scolding him. I wouldn't leave my wife for anything like that. I just put my foot down and say, Mrs. Davy, you've just got to do what'll please me, 'cause I'm a man." Davy. You're a little sexist.
That'd settle her pretty quick, I guess. But Annetta Clay says she left him because he wouldn't scrape his boots at the door, and she doesn't blame her. I'm going right over to Mr. Harrison's this minute to see what she's like.
Davy is... oh boy. A little sexist curmudgeon. Embodied. Davy soon returned, somewhat cast down.
Mrs. Harrison was away. She's gone to Carmody with Mrs. Rachel Lynde to get new paper for the parlor. And Mr. Harrison said to tell Anne to go over and see him, 'cause he wants to have a talk with her. And say the floor is scrubbed and Mr. Harrison is shaved, though there wasn't any preaching yesterday.
The Harrison kitchen wore a very unfamiliar look to Anne. The floor was indeed scrubbed to a wonderful pitch of purity, and so was every article of furniture in the room. The stove was polished until she could see her face in it. The walls were whitewashed, and the window panes sparkled in the sunlight. By the table sat Mr. Harrison in his working clothes, which on Friday had been noted for sundry rents and tatters, but which were now neatly patched and brushed. He was sprucely shaved, and what little hair he had was carefully trimmed. All right, I'm going to pause there for a moment. I'm going to put on some music, and then I'm going to get my phone charger and then just set up things a little bit differently so that I can keep my Instagram stream going. Sit tight for a moment. We'll just return our music to volubility. Enjoy the music. I'll be back in a moment. All right. One of these days I will get around to getting a proper tripod for my phone. Instagram folks, sit tight. You're going to be shaking around for a moment. So if you are prone to motion sickness, don't look. Just going to move you here and let you point at the ceiling for a moment. Facebook, we're going to move a little bit over. Alright, let's do that tune again. Whoop. Back we go. Okay, rearrange. Right, now, plugged in. And you can see my fancy tripod there, my soup ladle, but it works. Alright, and we are back in business. Let me just shift you a little bit. Perfect. Alright, Facebook. Alright, Instagram. Back to the reading. Now we won't die in the middle of things, or we shouldn't. Providing my charger is working, let me just check that it's plugged in properly. Yes, all is well. Sit down, Anne, sit down, said Mr. Harrison, in a tone but 2 degrees removed from that which Avonlea people used at funerals. Emily's gone over to Carmody with Rachel Lynde. She's struck up a lifelong friendship already with Rachel Lynde. Beats all how contrary women are. Well, Anne, my easy times are over, all over. It's neatness and tidiness for me for the rest of my natural life, I suppose. Mr. Harrison did his best to speak dolefully, but an irrepressible twinkle in his eye betrayed him. Mr. Harrison, you are glad your wife has come back, cried Anne, shaking her finger at him. You needn't pretend you're not, because I can see it plainly. Mr. Harrison relaxed into a sheepish smile. Well, I'm getting used to it, he conceded. I can't say I was sorry to see Emily. A man really needs some protection in a community like this, where he can't play a game of checkers with a neighbour without being accused of wanting to marry that neighbour's sister and having it put in the paper. Nobody would have supposed you went to see Isabella Andrews if you hadn't pretended to be unmarried, said Anne severely. I didn't pretend I was. If anybody'd have asked me if I was married, I'd have said I was. But they just took it for granted. I wasn't anxious to talk about the matter. I was feeling too sore over it. It would have been nuts from Mrs. Rachel Lynde if she had known my wife had left me, now wouldn't it now? But some people say that you left her. She started it, Anne, she started it. I'm going to tell you the whole story, for I don't want you to think worse of me than I deserve.
nor of Emily neither. But let's go out on the veranda. Everything is so fearful neat in here that it kind of makes me homesick. I suppose I'll get used to it after a while, but it eases me up to look at the yard. Emily hasn't had time to tidy it up yet." As soon as they were comfortably seated on the veranda, Mr. Harrison began his tale of woe. "I lived in Scottsford, New Brunswick, before I came here, Anne. My sister kept house for me, and she suited me fine. She was just reasonably tidy, and she let me alone and spoiled me, so Emily says. But 3 years ago she died. Before she died, she worried a lot about what was to become of me, and finally she got me to promise I'd get married. She advised me to take Emily Scott, because Emily had money of her own and was a pattern housekeeper. I said, says I, Emily Scott wouldn't look at me. 'You ask her and see,' says my sister, and just to ease her mind, I promised her I would, and I did, and Emily said she'd have me. Never was so surprised in my life, Anne. A smart, pretty little woman like her and an old fella like me. I tell you, I thought at first I was in luck. Well, we were married and took a little wedding trip up to St. John for a fortnight, and then we went home. We got home at 10 o'clock at night, and I give you my word, Anne, that in half an hour that woman was at work house cleaning. Oh, I know you're thinking my house needed it. You've got a very expressive face, Anne. Your thoughts come out on it like print. But it didn't, not that bad. It had got pretty mixed up while I was keeping bachelor's hall, I admit. But I'd got a woman to come in and clean it up before I was married, and there'd been considerable painting and fixing done. I tell you, if you took Emily into a brand new white marble palace, she'd be into the scrubbing as soon as she could get an old dress on. Well, she cleaned house till 1 o'clock that night, and at 4 she was up and at it again. And she kept on that way. Far as I could see, she never stopped. It was scour and sweep and dust everlasting, except on Sundays, and then she was just longing for Monday to begin again. But it was her way of amusing herself, and I could have reconciled myself to it if she'd left me alone. But that she wouldn't do. She'd set out to make me over, but she hadn't caught me young enough. I wasn't allowed to come into the house unless I changed my boots for slippers at the door. I doesn't smoke a pipe for my life unless I went to the barn, and I didn't use good enough grammar. Emily'd been a school teacher in her early life, and she'd never got over it. Then she hated to see me eating with my knife. Well, there it was, pick and nag everlasting. But I suppose, Anne, to be fair, I was cantankerous too. I didn't try to improve as I might have done. I just got cranky and disagreeable when she found fault. I told her one day she hadn't complained of my grammar when I proposed to her. It wasn't an overly tactful thing to say. A woman would forgive a man for beating her sooner than for hinting she was too much pleased to get him. Not sure about that, Mr. Harrison. Well, we bickered along like that, and it wasn't exactly pleasant. But we might have got used to each other after a spell if it hadn't been for Ginger. Ginger was the rock we split on at last. Emily didn't like parrots, and she couldn't stand Ginger's profane habits of speech. I was attached to the bird for my brother the sailor's sake. My brother the sailor was a pet of mine when we were little tads, and he'd sent Ginger to me when he was dying. I didn't see any sense in getting worked up over his swearing. There's nothing I hate worse than profanity in a human being, but in a parrot, that's just repeating what it's heard with no more understanding of it than I'd have a Greek. Allowances might be made. But Emily couldn't see it that way. She ain't logical. She tried to break Ginger of swearing, but she hadn't any better success than she had in trying to make me stop saying I seen and them things. Seemed as if the more she tried, the worse Ginger got, same as me. Hello, Olivia. Well, things went on like this, both of us getting raspier, till the climax came. Emily invited our minister and his wife to tea, and another minister and his wife that was visiting them. I'd promised to put Ginger away in some safe place where nobody would hear him. Emily wouldn't touch his cage with a 10-foot pole, and I meant to do it, for I didn't want the ministers to hear anything unpleasant in my house. But it slipped my mind. Emily was worrying me so much about clean colours and grammar that it wasn't any wonder, and I never thought of that poor parrot till we sat down to tea. Just as minister number 1 was in the very middle of saying grace, Ginger, who was on the veranda outside the dining room window, lifted up his voice. The gobbler had come into view in the yard, and the sight of a gobbler always had an unwholesome effect on Ginger. He surpassed himself that time. You can smile, Anne, and I don't deny I've chuckled some over it since myself. But at the time, I felt almost as much mortified as Emily. I went out and carried Ginger to the barn. I can't say that I enjoyed that meal. I knew by the look of Emily that there was trouble brewing for Ginger and James A. When the folks went away, I started to the cow pasture, and on the way I did some thinking. I felt sorry for Emily, and kind of fancied I hadn't been so thoughtful of her as I might. And besides, I wondered if the ministers would think that Ginger had learned his vocabulary from me. The long and short of it was, I decided that Ginger would have to be mercifully disposed of, and when I drove the cows home, I went in to tell Emily so. But there was no Emily, and there was a letter on the table, just according to the rule in storybooks. Emily writ that I'd have to choose between her and Ginger. She'd gone back to her own house, and there she would stay till I went and told her I'd got rid of that parrot. I was all riled up, Anne, and I said she might stay till doomsday if she waited for that, and I stuck to it. I packed up her belongings and sent them after her. It made an awful lot of talk. Scottsfield was pretty near as bad as Avonlea for gossip, and everybody sympathised with Emily. It kept me all cross and cantankerous, and I saw I'd have to get out or I'd never have any peace. I concluded I'd come to the island. I'd been here when I was a boy, and I liked it. But Emily had always said she wouldn't live in a place where folk were scared to walk out after dark for fear they'd fall off the edge. So just to be contrary, I moved over here. And that's all there is to it. I hadn't ever heard a word from or about Emily till I'd come home from the backfield Saturday and found her scrubbing the floor, but with the first decent dinner I'd had since she left me, all ready on the table. She told me to eat it first and then we'd talk, by which I concluded that Emily had learned some lessons about getting along with me. So she's here and she's going to stay, seeing that Ginger's dead and the island's some bigger than she thought. There's Mrs. Lynde in her now. No, don't go, Anne. Stay and get acquainted with Emily. She took quite a notion to you Saturday. Wanted to know who that handsome red-haired girl was at the next house. Mrs. Harrison welcomed Anne radiantly and insisted on her staying to tea. James A. has been telling me all about you and how kind you've been, making cakes and things for him, she said. I wanted to get acquainted with all my new neighbours just as soon as possible. Mrs. Lynde is a lovely woman, isn't she? So friendly. When Anne went home in the sweet June dusk, Mrs. Harrison went with her across the fields, where the fireflies were lighting their starry lamps. I suppose, said Mrs. Harrison confidentially, that James A. has told you our story. Yes. Then I needn't tell it, for James A. is a just man, and he would tell the truth. The blame was far from being all on his side. I can see that now. I wasn't back in my own house an hour before I wished I hadn't been so hasty, but I wouldn't give in. I see now that I expected too much of him, and I was real foolish to mind his bad grammar. It doesn't matter if he really does use bad grammar, so long as he's a good provider and doesn't go poking round the pantry to see how much sugar I've used in a week. I feel that James A. and I are going to be real happy now. I wish I knew who Observer is, so that I could thank him. I owe him a real debt of gratitude. Anne kept her own counsel, and Mrs. Harrison never knew that her gratitude found its way to its object. Anne felt rather bewildered over the far-reaching consequences of those foolish notes. They had reconciled a man to his wife and made the reputation of a prophet. Mrs. Lynde was in the Green Gables kitchen. She had been telling the whole story to Marilla. Well, and how do you like Mrs. Harrison? She asked Anne. Very much. I think she's a real nice little woman. That's exactly what she is, said Mrs. Rachel with emphasis. And as I've just been saying to Marilla, I think we all ought to overlook Mr. Harrison's peculiarities for her sake and try to make her feel at home here. That's what. Well, I must get back. Thomas will be worrying for me. I get out a little since Eliza came, and he seemed a lot better these past few days, but I never liked to be long away from him. I hear Gilbert Blythe has resigned from White Sands. He'll be off to college in the fall, I suppose. Mrs. Rachel looked sharply at Anne, but Anne was bending over a sleepy Davy, nodding on the sofa, and nothing was to be read in her face. She carried Davy away, her oval girlish cheek pressed against his curly yellow head. As they went up the stairs, Davy flung a tired arm around Anne's neck and gave her a warm hug and a sticky kiss. You're awful nice, Anne. Milty Bolter wrote on his slate today and showed it to Jenny Sloane. Roses red and violets blue. Sugar is sweet and so are you. And that expresses my feelings for you exactly, Anne.
Davy was sounding a little inebriated there. He was just tired. He hadn't been thinking. Chapter 26. Around the Bend. Thomas Lynde faded out of life as quietly and unobtrusively as he had lived it. His wife was a tender, patient, unwearied nurse. Sometimes Rachel had been a little hard on her Thomas in health, when his slowness or meekness had provoked her, but when he became ill, no voice could be lower, no hand more gently skillful, no vigil more uncomplaining. "You have been a good wife to me, Rachel," he once said simply, when she was sitting by him in the dusk, holding his thin, blanched old hand in one of her work-hardened ones. "A good wife. I'm sorry I ain't leaving you better off, but the children will look after you. They're all smart, capable children, just like their mother. A good mother, a good woman." He'd fallen asleep then, and the next morning, just as the white dawn was creeping up over the pointed firs in the hollow, Marilla went softly into the east gable and wakened Anne. "Anne, Thomas Lynde is gone. The hired boy just brought the word. I'm going right down to Rachel." On the day after Thomas Lynde's funeral, Marilla went about Green Gables with a strangely preoccupied air. Occasionally she looked at Anne, seemed on the point of saying something, then shook her head and buttoned up her mouth. After tea she went down to see Mrs. Rachel, and when she returned she went to the east gable, where Anne was correcting school exercises. "How's Mrs. Lynde tonight?" asked the latter. "She's feeling calmer and more composed," answered Marilla, sitting down on Anne's bed, a proceeding which betokened some unusual mental excitement, for in Marilla's code of household ethics, to sit on a bed after it was made up was an unpardonable offence. "But she's very lonely. Eliza had to go home today. Her son isn't well and she felt she couldn't stay any longer." "When I finish these exercises I'll run down and chat a while with Mrs. Lynde," said Anne. "I'd intended to study some Latin composition tonight, but it can wait." "I suppose Gilbert Blythe is going to college in the fall," said Marilla jerkily. "How would you like to go too, Anne?" Anne looked up in astonishment. "I would like it, of course, Marilla, but it isn't possible." "I guess it can be made possible. I've always felt that you should go. I never felt easy to think you were giving it all up on my account. But Marilla, I've never been sorry for a moment that I stayed home. I've been so happy. Oh, these past 2 years have just been delightful." "Oh yes, I know you've been contented enough, but that isn't the question exactly. You ought to go on with your education. You've saved enough to put you through 1 year at Redmond, and the money the stock brought in will do for another year, and there's scholarships and things you might win." "Yes, but I can't go, Marilla. Your eyes are better, of course, but I can't leave you alone with the twins. They need so much looking after." "I won't be alone with them. That's what I want to discuss with you. I had a long talk with Rachel tonight, and she's feeling dreadful bad over a good many things. She's not left very well off. It seems they mortgaged the farm 8 years ago to give the youngest boy a start when he went west, and they've never been able to pay much more than the interest since. And then, of course, Thomas' illness has cost a good deal one way and another. The farm will have to be sold, and Rachel thinks there'll be hardly anything left after the bills are settled. She says she'll have to go and live with Eliza, and it's breaking her heart to think of leaving Avonlea. A woman of her age doesn't make new friends and interests easy. And Anne, as she talked about it, the thought came to me that I would ask her to come and live with me, but I thought I ought to talk it over with you first, before I said anything to her. If I had Rachel living with me, you could go to college. How do you feel about it?" I feel as if somebody had handed me the moon, and I didn't know exactly what to do with it," said Anne dazedly. "But as for asking Mrs. Lynde to come here, that is for you to decide, Marilla. Are you sure you would like it? Mrs. Lynde is a good woman and a kind neighbor, but she's got her faults, you mean to say?" "Well, she has, of course, but I think I'd rather put up with far worse faults than see Rachel go away from Avonlea. I'd miss her terrible. She's the only close friend I've got here, and I'd be lost without her. We've been neighbours for 45 years, and we've never had a quarrel, though we came rather near it that time you flew at Mrs. Rachel for calling you homely and red-headed. Do you remember, Anne?" "I should think I do," said Anne ruefully. "People don't forget things like that. How I hated poor Mrs. Rachel at that moment. And then that apology you made her.
Well, you were a handful in all conscience, Anne. I did feel so puzzled and bewildered how to manage you. Matthew understood you better. Matthew understood everything, said Anne softly, as she always spoke of him. Well, I think it could be managed so that Rachel and I wouldn't clash at all. It always seemed to me that the reason two women can't get along in one house is that they try to share the same kitchen and get in each other's way. Now, if Rachel came here, she could have the north gable for her bedroom and the spare room for her kitchen as well as not, for we don't really need a spare room at all. She could put her stove there and what furniture she wanted to keep and be really comfortable and independent. She'll have enough to live on, of course. Her children will see to that. So all I'd be giving her would be house room. Yes, Anne, as far as I'm concerned, I'd like it. Then ask her, said Anne promptly. I'd be very sorry myself to see Mrs. Rachel go away. And if she comes, continued Marilla, you can go to college as well as not. She'll be company for me and she'll do for the twins what I can't do. So there's no reason in the world why you shouldn't go. Anne had a long meditation at her window that night. Joy and regret struggled together in her heart. She had come at last, suddenly and unexpectedly, to the bend in the road, and college was around it, with 100 rainbow hopes and visions. But Anne realized as well that when she rounded that curve, she must leave behind many sweet things. All the little simple duties and interests which had grown so dear to her in the last 2 years, in which she had glorified into beauty and delight by the enthusiasm she had put into them. She must give up her school, and she loved every one of her pupils, even the stupid and naughty ones. The mere thought of Paul Irving made her wonder if Redmond were such a name to conjure with after all. I've put a lot of little roots out these 2 years, Anne told the moon, and when I'm pulled up they're going to hurt a great deal. But it's best to go, I think, and as Marilla says, there's no good reason why I shouldn't. I must get out all my ambitions and dust them. Anne sent in her resignation the next day, and Mrs. Rachel, after a heart-to-heart talk with Marilla, gratefully accepted the offer of a home at Green Gables. She elected to remain in her own house for the summer, however. The farm was not to be sold until the fall, and there were many arrangements to be made.
Hello, Aunt Sherry. I'm so glad that you're enjoying it.
I'd certainly never thought of living as far off the road as Green Gables, sighed Mrs. Rachel to herself. But really, Green Gables doesn't seem as out of the world as it used to do. Anne has lots of company, and the twins make it real lively. But anyhow, I'd rather live at the bottom of a well than leave Avonlea. These two decisions, being noised abroad, speedily ousted the arrival of Mrs. Harrison in popular gossip. Sage heads were shaken over Marilla Cuthbert's rash step in asking Mrs. Rachel to live with her. People opined that they wouldn't get on together. They were both too fond of their own way, and many doleful predictions were made. None of which disturbed the parties in question at all. They had come to a clear and distinct understanding of the respective duties and rights of their new arrangements, and meant to abide by them. I won't meddle with you, nor you with me, Mrs. Rachel had said decidedly, and as for the twins, I'll be glad to do all I can for them, but I won't undertake to answer Davy's questions, that's what. I'm not an encyclopedia, neither am I a Philadelphia lawyer. You'll miss Anne for that. Sometimes Anne's answers were about as queer as Davy's questions, said Marilla dryly. The twins will miss her, no mistake, but her future can't be sacrificed to Davy's thirst for information. When he asks questions I can't answer, I'll just tell him children should be seen and not heard. That's how I was brought up, and I don't know but what it was just as good a way as all these newfangled notions for training children. Well, Anne's methods seem to have worked fairly well with Davy, said Mrs. Lynde smilingly. He's a reformed character, that's what. He isn't a bad little soul, conceded Marilla. I never expected to get as fond of those children as I have. Davy gets round you somehow, and Dora is a lovely child, although she's kind of monotonous. Exactly, supplied Mrs. Rachel. Like a book where every page is the same. That's what. Dora will make a good, reliable lady, but she'll never set the pond on fire. Well, that sort of folks are comfortable to have round, even if they're not as interesting as the other kind. Gilbert Blythe was probably the only person to whom the news of Anne's resignation brought unmixed pleasure. Her pupils looked upon it as a sheer catastrophe,
Annetta Bell had hysterics when she went home. Anthony Pye fought 2 pitched and unprovoked battles with other boys by way of relieving his feelings. Barbara Shaw cried all night. Paul Irving defiantly told his grandmother that she needn't expect him to eat any porridge for a week. "I can't do it, Grandma," he said. "I don't really know if I can eat anything. I feel as if there was a dreadful lump in my throat. I'd have cried coming home from school if Jake Donnell hadn't been watching me. I believe I will cry after I go to bed. It wouldn't show on my eyes tomorrow, would it? And it would be such a relief. But anyway, I can't eat porridge. I'm going to need all my strength of mind to bear up against this, Grandma, and I won't have any left to grapple with porridge. Oh, Grandma, I don't know what I'll do when my beautiful teacher goes away. Milty Bolter says he bets Jane Andrews will get the school. I suppose Miss Andrews is very nice, but I know she won't understand things like Miss Shirley." Diana also took a very pessimistic view of affairs. "It will be horribly lonesome here next winter," she mourned, one twilight when the moonlight was raining airy silver through the cherry boughs, and filling the east gable with a soft, dreamlike radiance, in which the 2 girls sat and talked. Anne on her low rocker by the window, Diana sitting Turk fashion on the bed. "You and Gilbert will be gone, and the Allens too. They're going to call Mr. Allen charlatan, and of course he'll accept. It's too mean. We'll be vacant all winter, I suppose, and have to listen to a long string of candidates, and half of them won't be any good." "I hope they won't call Mr. Baxter from East Grafton here anyhow," said Anne decidedly. "He wants the call, but he does preach such gloomy sermons. Mr. Bell says he's a minister of the old school, but Mrs. Lynde says there's nothing whatever the matter with him but indigestion. His wife isn't a very good cook, it seems, and Mrs. Lynde says that when a man has to eat sour bread 2 weeks out of 3, his theology is bound to get a kink in it somewhere. Mrs. Allen feels very bad about going away. She says everybody has been so kind to her since she came here as a bride that she feels as if she were leaving lifelong friends. And then there's the baby's grave, you know. She says she doesn't see how she can go away and leave that. It was such a little mite of a thing, and only 3 months old. And she says she's afraid it will miss its mother, although she knows better and wouldn't say so to Mr. Allen for anything. She says she has slipped through the birch grove back of the manse nearly every night to the graveyard, and sung a little lullaby to it. She told me all about it last evening when I was putting up some of those early wild roses on Matthew's grave. I promised her that as long as I was in Avonlea, I would put flowers on the baby's grave, and when I was away, I felt sure that I would do it," supplied Anna heartily. "Of course I will, and I'll put them on Matthew's grave too, for your sake, Anne." "Oh, thank you. I meant to ask you if you would, and on little Hester Gray's too. Please don't forget hers. Do you know, I've thought and dreamed so much about little Hester Gray that she's become strangely real to me. I think of her back there in her little garden in that cool, still green corner, and I have a fancy that if I could steal back there some spring evening, just at the magic time twixt light and dark, and tiptoe so softly up the beech hill that my footsteps could not frighten her, I would find the garden just as it used to be, all sweet with June lilies and early roses, with the tiny house beyond it all hung with vines, and little Hester Gray would be there with her soft eyes and the wind ruffling her dark hair, wandering about, putting her fingertips under the chins of the lilies, and whispering secrets with the roses. And I would go forward, oh so softly, and hold out my hands and say to her, 'Little Hester Gray, won't you let me be your playmate, for I love the roses too?' And we would sit down on the old bench and talk a little and dream a little, or just be beautifully silent together. And then the moon would rise, and I would look around me, and there would be no Hester Gray, and no little vine-hung house, and no roses, only an old waste garden, starred with June lilies amid the grasses, and the wind sighing, oh so sorrowfully, in the cherry trees, and I would not know whether it had all been real, or if I had just imagined it all." Diana crawled up and got her back against the headboard of the bed. When your companion of twilight hour said such spooky things, it was just as well not to be able to fancy there was anything behind you. "I imagine the Improvement Society will go down when you and Gilbert are both gone," she remarked dolefully. "Not a bit of fear of it," said Anne briskly, coming back from dreamland to the affairs of practical life. "It is too firmly established for that, especially since the older people are becoming so enthusiastic about it. Look what they're doing this summer for their lawns and lanes. Besides, I'll be watching for hints at Redmond, and I'll write a paper for it next week and send it over. Don't take such a gloomy view of things, Diana. And don't grudge me my little hour of gladness and jubilation now. Later on, when I have to go away, I'll feel anything but glad. It's all right for you to be glad. You're going to college, and you're going to have a jolly time and make heaps of lovely new friends." "I hope I shall make new friends," said Anne thoughtfully. "The possibilities of making new friends help to make life very fascinating. But no matter how many new friends I make, they'll never be as dear to me as the old ones. Especially a certain girl with black eyes and dimples. Can you guess who she is, Diana?" "But there'll be so many clever girls at Redmond," sighed Diana, "and I'm only a stupid little country girl who says I seen sometimes, though I really know better when I stop to think. Well, of course these past 2 years have really been too pleasant to last. I know somebody was glad you're going to Redmond anyhow. Anne, I'm going to ask you a question, a serious question. Don't be vexed, and do answer seriously. Do you care anything for Gilbert?" "Ever so much as a friend, and not a bit in the way you mean," said Anne calmly and decidedly. She also thought she was speaking sincerely. Diana sighed. She wished somehow that Anne had answered differently. "Don't you ever mean to be married, Anne?" "Perhaps some day, when I meet the right one," said Anne, smiling dreamily up at the moonlight. "But how can you be sure when you do meet the right one?" persisted Diana. "Oh, I should know him. Something would tell me. You know what my ideal is, Diana. But people's ideals change sometimes. Mine won't. And I couldn't care for any man who didn't fulfill it." "What if you never meet him?" "Then I shall die an old maid," was the cheerful response. "I dare say it isn't the hardest death by any means." "Oh, I suppose the dying would be easy enough. It's the living an old maid I shouldn't like," said Diana, with no intention of being humorous. "Although I wouldn't mind being an old maid very much if I could be one like Miss Lavender, but I never could be. When I'm 45 I'll be horribly fat. And while there might be some romance about a thin old maid, there couldn't possibly be any about a fat one. Oh, mind you, Nelson Atkins proposed to Ruby Gillis 3 weeks ago. Ruby told me all about it. She says she never had any intention of taking him, because anyone who married him will have to go in with the old folks. But Ruby says that he made such a perfectly beautiful and romantic proposal that it simply swept her off her feet. But she didn't want to do anything rash, so she asked for a week to consider. And 2 days later, she was at a meeting of the sewing circle at his mother's, and there was a book called The Complete Guide to Etiquette lying on the parlor table. Ruby said she simply couldn't describe her feelings when in a section of it headed The Deportment of Courtship and Marriage, she found the very proposal Nelson had made, word for word. She went home and wrote him a perfectly scathing refusal, and she says his father and mother have taken turns watching him ever since, for fear he'll drown himself in the river. But Ruby says they needn't be afraid, for in the Deportment of Courtship and Marriage it told how a rejected lover should behave, and there's nothing about drowning in that. And she says Wilbur Blair is literally pining away for her, but she's perfectly helpless in the matter." Anne made an impatient movement. "I hate to say it. It seems so disloyal, but, well, I don't like Ruby Gillis now. I liked her when we went to school in Queens together, though not so well as you and Jane, of course. But this last year at Carmody she seems so different, so... "I know," nodded Diana. "It's the Gillis coming out in her. She can't help it. Mrs. Lynde says that if ever a Gillis girl thought about anything but the boys, she never showed it in her walk and conversation. She talks about nothing but boys, and what compliments they pay her, and how crazy they are all about her at Carmody. And the strange thing is, they are, too." Diane admitted this somewhat resentfully. "Last night when I saw her in Mr. Blair's store, she whispered to me that she just made a new mash. I wouldn't ask her who it was, because I knew she was dying to be asked. Well, it's what Ruby always wanted, I suppose. You remember even when she was little, she always said she meant to have dozens of beaux when she grew up, and have the very gayest time she could before she settled down. She's so different from Jane, isn't she? Jane is such a nice, sensible, ladylike girl." "Dear old Jane is a jewel," agreed Anne. "But," she added, leaning forward to bestow a tender pat on the plump, dimpled little hand hanging over her pillow, "there's nobody like my own Diana, after all. Do you remember that evening we first met, Diana, and swore eternal friendship in your garden? We've kept that oath, I think. We've never had a quarrel, nor even a coolness. I shall never forget the thrill that went over me the day you told me you loved me. I had had such a lonely, starved heart all through my childhood. I'm just beginning to realize how starved and lonely it really was. Nobody cared anything for me or wanted to be bothered with me. I should have been miserable if it hadn't been for that strange little dream life of mine, wherein I imagined all the friends and love I craved. But when I came to Green Gables, everything was changed. And then I met you. You don't know what your friendship meant to me. I want to thank you here and now, dear, for the warm and true affection you've always given me. And always, always will, sobbed Diana. I shall never love anybody, any girl, half as well as I love you. And if I ever do marry and have a little girl of my own, I'm going to name her Anne.
Oh, that's sweet, that is. All right. Chapter 27. An afternoon at the stone house.
Where are you going all dressed up, Anne?
Davy wanted to know.
You look bully in that dress.
Anne had come down to dinner in a new dress of pale green muslin, the first colour she had worn since Matthew's death. It became her perfectly, bringing out all the delicate flower-like tints of her face and the gloss and burnish of her hair. Davy, how many times have I told you that you mustn't use that word? She rebuked. I'm going to Echo Lodge.
Take me with you,
entreated Davy.
I would if I were driving, but I'm going to walk and it's too far for your 8-year-old legs. Besides, Paul is going with me and I fear you don't enjoy yourself in his company. Oh, I like Paul lots better than I did,
said Davy, beginning to make fearful inroads into his pudding.
Since I got pretty good myself, I don't mind his being gooder so much. If I can keep on, I'll catch up with him some day, both in legs and goodness. Besides, Paul's real nice to us second primer boys in school. He won't let the other big boys meddle with us, and he shows us lots of games.
How came Paul to fall into the brook at noon hour yesterday? Asked Anne. I met him on the playground, such a dripping figure that I sent him promptly home for dry clothes, without waiting to find out what had happened.
Well, it was partly his accident, explained Davy. He stuck his head in on purpose, but the rest of him fell in accidentally. We was all down at the brook, and Pretty Rogerson got mad at Paul about something. She's awful mean and horrid anyway, if she is pretty, and said that his grandmother put his hair up in rag curls every night. Paul wouldn't have minded what she said, I guess, but Gracie Andrews laughed, and Paul got awful red, 'cause Gracie's his girl, you know. He's clean gone on her, brings her flowers and carries her books as far as the shore road. He got as red as a beet and said his grandmother didn't do any such thing and his hair was born curly. And then he laid down on the bank and stuck his head right into the spring to show him. Oh, it wasn't the spring we drink out of, seeing a horrified look on Marilla's face. It was the little one lower down. But the bank's awful slippy, and Paul went right in. I tell you, he made a bully splash. Oh, Anne, I didn't mean to say that. It just slipped out before I thought. He made a splendid splash. But he looked so funny when he crawled out, all wet and muddy. The girls laughed more than ever, but Gracie didn't laugh. She looked sorry. Gracie's a nice girl, but she's got a snub nose. When I get big enough to have a girl, I won't have one with a snub nose. I'll pick one with a pretty nose like yours, Anne.
A boy who makes such a mess of syrup all over his face when he's eating his pudding will never get a girl to look at him, said Marilla severely.
But I'll wash my face before I go courting,
protested Davy, trying to improve matters by rubbing the back of his hand over the smears.
And I'll wash behind my ears, too, without being told. I remembered to this morning, Marilla. I don't forget half as often as I did, but, and Davy sighed, there's so many corners about a fellow that it's awful hard to remember them all. Well, if I can't go to Miss Lavender's, I'll go over and see Mrs. Harrison. Mrs. Harrison's an awful nice woman, I tell you. She keeps a jar of cookies in her pantry a purpose for little boys, and she always gives me the scrapings out of a pan she's mixed up a plum cake in. A good many plums stick to the sides, you see. Mr. Harrison was always a nice man, but he's twice as nice since he got married over again. I guess getting married makes folks nicer. Why don't you get married, Marilla? I want to know.
Marilla's state of single blessedness had never been a sore point with her, so she answered amiably, with an exchange of significant looks with Anne, that she supposed it was because nobody would have her.
But maybe you never asked anybody to have you, protested Davy. Oh, Davy, said Dora primly, shocked into speaking without being spoken to. It's the men that have to do the asking. I don't know why they have to do it always, grumbled Davy. Seems to me everything's put on the men in this world. Can I have some more pudding, Marilla? Davy. Every time I'm reading Davy, I have so much fun with his voice. But some of the things he says, it's... Where did you get that? Anyway,
Can I have some more pudding, Marilla?
you've had as much as was good for you, said Marilla, but she gave him a moderate second helping.
I wish people could live on pudding. Why can't they, Marilla? I want to know.
Because they'd soon get tired of it,
I'd like to try that for myself,
said skeptical Davy.
but I guess it's better to have pudding only on fish and company days than none at all. They never have any at Milty Bolter's. Milty says when company comes, his mother gives him cheese and cuts it herself, only a little bit apiece and one over for manners.
If Milty Bolter talks like that about his mother, at least you needn't repeat it, said Marilla severely.
Bless my soul!
Davy had picked this expression up from Mr. Harrison and used it with great gusto.
Milty meant it as a compliment. He's awful proud of his mother, 'cause folks say she could scratch a living on a rock.
I suppose them pesky hens are in my pansy bed again, said Marilla, rising and going out hurriedly. The slandered hens were nowhere near the pansy bed, and Marilla did not even glance at it. Instead, she sat down on the cellar hatch and laughed until she was ashamed of herself. When Anne and Paul reached the stone house that afternoon, they found Miss Lavendar and Charlotta the Fourth in the garden, weeding, raking, clipping, and trimming as if for dear life. Miss Lavendar herself, all gay and sweet in the frills and laces she loved, dropped her shears and ran joyously to meet her guests, while Charlotta the Fourth grinned cheerfully. "Welcome, Anne. I thought you'd come today. You belong to the afternoon, so it brought you. Things that belong together are sure to come together. What a lot of trouble that would save some people if they only knew it. But they don't. And so they waste beautiful energy moving heaven and earth to bring things together that don't belong. And you, Paul, why, you've grown. You're half a head taller than when you were here before." "Yes, I've begun to grow like pigweed in the night, as Mrs. Lynde says," said Paul, in frank delight over the fact. "Grandma says it's the porridge taking effect at last. Perhaps it is. Goodness knows." Paul sighed deeply. "I've eaten enough to make anyone grow. I do hope, now that I've begun, I'll keep on till I'm as tall as father. He is 6 feet, you know, Miss Lavendar." Being an adult is being able to make yourself a sheet cake whenever you want. Like, I have a bag full of chocolate. I can eat it if I want. Of course, being an adult is also being able to make yourself a sheet cake whenever you want.
He's 6 feet, you know, Miss Lavendar."
Yes, Miss Lavendar did know. The flush on her pretty cheeks deepened a little, and she took Paul's hand on one side and Anne's on the other, and walked through the house in silence.
"Is it a good day for the echoes, Miss Lavendar?"
queried Paul anxiously. The day of his first visit had been too windy for echoes, and Paul had been much disappointed.
"Yes, just the best kind of a day," answered Miss Lavendar, rousing herself from her reverie. "But first, we are all going in to have something to eat. I know you two folks didn't walk all the way back here through those beech woods without getting hungry, and Charlotta the Fourth and I can eat any hour of the day. We have such obliging appetites. So we'll just make a raid on the pantry. Fortunately, it's lovely and full. I had a presentiment that I was going to have company today, and Charlotta the Fourth and I are prepared." "I think you are one of those people who always have nice things in their pantry," declared Paul. "Grandma's like that too, but she doesn't approve of snacks between meals. I wonder," he added meditatively, "if I ought to eat them away from home when I know she doesn't approve." "Oh, I don't think she would disapprove after you've had a long walk. That makes a difference," said Miss Lavendar, exchanging amused glances with Anne over Paul's brown curls. "I suppose that snacks are extremely unwholesome. That is why we have them so often at Echo Lodge. We, Charlotta the Fourth and I, live in defiance of every known law of diet. We eat all sorts of indigestible things whenever we happen to think of it, by day or by night, and we flourish like green bay trees. We are always intending to reform. When we read any article in a paper warning us against something we like, we cut it out and pin it up on the kitchen wall so that we'll remember it. But we never can, somehow, until after we've gone and eaten that very thing. Nothing has ever killed us yet, but Charlotta the Fourth has been known to have bad dreams after we've eaten donuts and mince pie and fruitcake before we went to bed. Grandma lets me have a glass of milk and a slice of bread and butter before I go to bed, And on Sunday night she puts jam on the bread, said Paul. So I'm always glad when it's Sunday night, for more reasons than one. Sunday is a very long day on the shore road. Grandma says it's all too short for her, and that Father never found Sundays tiresome when he was a little boy. It wouldn't seem so long if I could talk to my rock people, but I never do that because Grandma doesn't approve of it on Sundays. I think a good deal, but I'm afraid my thoughts are very worldly. Grandma says we should never think anything but religious thoughts on Sundays.
I'm just about to run out of time on Instagram, so sit tight, Facebook folks. I'm going to restart my Instagram stream. I'm going to end this one and start another. So sign right back in, friends. We'll be back in just a moment. Doot, 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 doot. Changing. Oh, whoop! I forgot it was plugged in. Da, 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 da. I'm just adding the title. Avonlea. Part is it? I think we're on part 8 now. I was expecting 12 parts, but I think we will only have 9. 1 of 2. Alright. There we go. That is posting. La 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 la. And now, back to business. We'll just give it a moment for folks to rejoin. I really like Miss Lavender Lewis. She's such a whimsical person, and I think that life deserves to have whimsy in it. Hello, welcome back. Alright, we're all back, I think. So we're going to get started again. Grandma says we should never think anything but religious thoughts on Sundays. But teacher here said once that every really beautiful thought was religious, no matter what it was about or what day we thought it on. But I feel sure Grandma thinks that sermons and Sunday school lessons are the only things you can think truly religious thoughts about. And when it comes to a difference of opinion between Grandma and teacher, I don't know what to do. In my heart, Paul laid his hand on his breast and raised very serious blue eyes to Miss Lavender's immediately sympathetic face. I agree with teacher, but then, you see, Grandmother has brought Father up her way and made a brilliant success of him, and teacher has never brought anybody up yet, though she's helping with Davy and Dora. But you can't tell how they'll turn out till they are grown up. So sometimes I feel as if it might be safer to go by Grandma's opinions. I think it would, agreed Anne solemnly. Anyway, I dare say that if your Grandma and I both got down to what we really do mean, under our different ways of expressing it, we'd find out that we both meant the same thing. You'd better go by her way of expressing it, since it's been the result of experience. We'll just have to wait until we see how the twins do turn out before we can be sure that my way is equally good. I will indeed. Thanks, Aunt Fairy. After lunch, they went back to the garden, where Paul made the acquaintance of the echoes, to his wonder and delight, while Anne and Miss Lavender sat on the stone bench under the poplar and talked. "So you're going away in the fall," said Miss Lavender wistfully. "I ought to be glad for your sake, Anne, but I'm horribly, selfishly sorry. I shall miss you so much. Oh, sometimes I think is it no use to make friends. They only go out of your life after a while and leave a hurt that is worse than the emptiness before they came." "That sounds like something Miss Eliza Andrews might say, but never Miss Lavender," said Anne. "Nothing is worse than emptiness, and I'm not going out of your life. There are such things as letters and vacations. Dearest, I'm afraid you're looking a little pale and tired." "Oh, hoo, went Paul on the dyke, where he had been making noises diligently, not all of them melodious in the making, but all coming back transmuted into the very gold and silver of sound by the fairy alchemists over the river. Miss Lavender made an impatient movement with her pretty hands. "I'm just tired of everything, even of the echoes. There's nothing in my life but echoes, echoes of lost hopes and dreams and joys. They're beautiful and mocking. Oh, Anne, it's horrid of me to talk like this when I have company. It's just that I'm getting old and it doesn't agree with me. I know I'll be fearfully cranky by the time I'm 60, but perhaps all I need is a course of blue pills." At this moment, Charlotta the Fourth, who had disappeared after lunch, returned and announced that the northeast corner of Mr. John Kimball's pasture was red with early strawberries, and wouldn't Miss Shirley like to go and pick some? "Early strawberries for tea!" exclaimed Miss Lavender. "Oh, I'm not so old as I thought, and I don't need a single blue pill. Girls, when you come back with your strawberries, we'll have tea out here under the silver poplar. I'll have it all ready for you with home-grown cream." Anne and Charlotta the Fourth accordingly betook themselves back to Mr. Kimball's pasture, a green remote place, where the air was as soft as velvet. She is delightful. And fragrant as a bed of violets and as golden as amber. "Oh, isn't it sweet and fresh back here?" breathed Anne. "I just feel as if I were drinking in the sunshine." "Yes, ma'am, so do I. That's just exactly how I feel too, ma'am," agreed Charlotta the Fourth, who would have said precisely the same thing if Anne had remarked that she felt like a pelican of the wilderness. Always after Anne had visited Echo Lodge, Charlotta the Fourth mounted to her little room over the kitchen, and tried before her looking-glass to speak and look and move like Anne. Charlotta could never flatter herself that she quite succeeded, but practice makes perfect, as Charlotta had learned at school, and she fondly hoped that in time she might catch the trick of that dainty uplift of the chin, that quick, starry-out flashing of eyes, that fashion of walking as if you were a bough swaying in the wind. It seemed so easy when you watched Anne. Charlotta the Fourth admired Anne wholeheartedly. It was not so much that she thought her so very handsome. Diana Barry's beauty of crimson cheek and black curls was much more to Charlotta the Fourth's taste than Anne's moonshine charm of luminous grey eyes and the pale, ever-changing roses of her cheeks. "But I'd rather look like you than be pretty," she told Anne sincerely. Anne laughed, sipped the honey from the tribute, and cast away the sting. She was used to taking her compliments mixed. Public opinion had never agreed on Anne's looks. People who had heard her called handsome met her and were disappointed. People who had heard her called plain saw her and wondered where other people's eyes were. Anne herself would never believe that she had any claim to beauty. When she looked in the glass, all she saw was a little pale face with 7 freckles on the nose thereof. Her mirror never revealed to her the elusive, ever-varying play of feeling that came and went over her features like a rosy, illuminating flame, or the charm of dream and laughter alternating in her big eyes. "What big eyes you have!" While Anne was not beautiful in any strictly defined sense of the word, she possessed a certain evasive charm and distinction of appearance that left beholders with a pleasurable sense of satisfaction in that softly rounded girlhood of hers, with all its strongly felt potentialities. Those who knew Anne best felt, without realizing that they felt it, that her greatest attraction was the aura of possibility surrounding her, the power of future development that was in her. She seemed to walk in an atmosphere of things about to happen. "Hello, Tyrell." As they picked, Charlotta the Fourth confided to Anne her fears regarding Miss Lavender. The warm-hearted little handmaiden was honestly worried over her adored mistress's condition. "Miss Lavender isn't well, Miss Shirley, ma'am. I'm sure she isn't, though she never complains. She hasn't seemed like herself this long while, ma'am. Not since that day you and Paul were here together before. I feel sure she caught cold that night, ma'am. After you and him had gone, she went out and walked in the garden for long after dark with nothing but a little shawl on her. There was a lot of snow on the walks, and I feel sure she got a chill, ma'am. Even ever since then, I've noticed her acting tired and lonesome like. She don't seem to take an interest in anything, ma'am. She never pretends company's coming, nor fixes up for it, nor nothing, ma'am. It's only when you come she seems to chirk up a bit. And the worst sign of all, Miss Shirley, ma'am." Charlotta the Fourth lowered her voice, as if she were about to tell some exceedingly weird and awful symptom indeed, "is that she never gets cross now when I break things. Why, Miss Shirley, ma'am, yesterday I broke her green and yaller bowl that's always stood on the bookcase. Her grandmother brought it out from England, and Miss Lavender was awful choice of it. I was dusting it just as careful, Miss Shirley, ma'am, and it slipped out so fashion afore I could grab hold of it, and it broke in about 40 million pieces. I tell you, I was sorry and scared. I thought Miss Lavender would scold me awful, ma'am, and I'd rather she had than take it the way she did. She just come in and hardly looked at it and said, 'It's no matter, Charlotta. Take up the pieces and throw them away.' Just like that, Miss Shirley, ma'am. Take up the pieces and throw them away.
as if it wasn't her grandmother's bowl from England. Oh, she isn't well, and I feel awful bad about it. She's got nobody to look after her but me."
Charlotta the Fourth's eyes brimmed up with tears. Anne patted her little brown hand, holding the cracked pink cup sympathetically. "I think Miss Lavender needs a change, Charlotta. She stays here alone too much. Can't we induce her to go away for a little trip?" Charlotta shook her head with its rampant bows, disconsolately. "I don't think so, Miss Shirley, ma'am. Miss Lavender hates visiting. She's only got 3 relations she ever visits, and she says she just goes to see them as a family duty. Last time, when she come home, she said she wasn't going to visit for family duty no more. 'I've come home in love with loneliness, Charlotta,' she says to me, 'and I never want to stray from my own vine and fig tree again. My relations try so hard to make an old lady of me, and it has a bad effect on me.' Just like that, Miss Shirley, ma'am. It has a very bad effect on me. So I don't think it would do any good to coax her to go visiting." "We must see what can be done," said Anne decidedly, as she put the last possible berry in her pink cup. "Just as soon as I have my vacation, I'll come through and spend a whole week with you. We'll have a picnic every day and pretend all sorts of interesting things, and see if we can't cheer Miss Lavender up." "That will be the very thing, Miss Shirley, ma'am," exclaimed Charlotta the Fourth in rapture. She was glad for Miss Lavender's sake, and for her own too. With a whole week in which to study Anne constantly, she would surely be able to learn how to move and behave like her. When the girls got back to Echo Lodge, they found that Miss Lavender and Paul had carried the little square table out of the kitchen to the garden, and had everything ready for tea. Nothing ever tasted so delicious as those strawberries and cream, eaten under a great blue sky, all curdled over with fluffy little white clouds, and in the long shadows of the wood with its lispings and its murmurings. After tea, Anne helped Charlotta wash the dishes in the kitchen, while Miss Lavender sat on the stone bench with Paul and heard all about his rock people. She was a good listener, this sweet Miss Lavender, but just at last it struck Paul that she had suddenly lost interest in the twin sailors. "Miss Lavender, why do you look at me like that?" he asked gravely. "How do I look, Paul?" "Just as if you were looking through me at somebody I put you in mind of," said Paul, who had such occasional flashes of uncanny insight that it wasn't quite safe to have secrets when he was about. "You do put me in mind of somebody I knew long ago," said Miss Lavender dreamily. "When you were young?" "Yes, when I was young. Do I seem very old to you, Paul?" "Do you know, I can't make up my mind about that," said Paul confidentially. "Your hair looks old. I never knew a young person with white hair. But your eyes are as young as my beautiful teacher's when you laugh. I tell you what, Miss Lavender," Paul's voice and face were as solemn as a judge's, "I think you would make a splendid mother. You have just the right look in your eyes, the look of my little mother always had. I think it's a pity you haven't any boys of your own." "I have a little dream boy, Paul." "Oh, have you really? How old is he?" "About your age, I think. He ought to be older, because I dreamed him long before you were born. But I'll never let him get any older than 11 or 12. Because if I did someday, he might grow up altogether, and then I'd lose him." "I know," nodded Paul. "That's the beauty of dream people. They stay any age you want them. You and my beautiful teacher and me and myself are the only folks in the world that I know of that have dream people. Isn't it funny and nice that we should all know each other? But I guess that kind of people always find each other out. Grandma never has dream people, and Mary Jo thinks I'm wrong in the upper story because I have them. But I think it's splendid to have them. You know, Miss Lavender. Tell me all about your little dream boy." "He has blue eyes and curly hair. He steals in and wakens me with a kiss every morning. Then all day he plays here in the garden, and I play with him. Such games as we have. We run races and talk with the echoes, and I tell him stories. And when twilight comes—" "I know," interrupted Paul eagerly. "He comes and sits beside you, so, because of course at 12 he'd be too big to climb in your lap, and lays his head on your shoulders, so, and you put your arms about him and hold him tight, tight, and rest your cheek on his head. Yeah, that's the very way. Oh, you do know, Miss Lavender." Anne found the two of them there when she came out of the stone house, and something in Miss Lavender's face made her hate to disturb them. "I'm afraid we must go, Paul, if we want to get home before dark. Miss Lavender, I'm going to invite myself to Echo Lodge for a whole week pretty soon. If you come for a week, I'll keep you for 2, threatened Miss Lavender. You know, we don't have that much left to go. We could probably finish this if we go on for about another 40 minutes or so. What do you think? Just send me a little... He is kind of whimsical like Peter Pan, Michelle. I sort of imagine him that way. I'm glad you're enjoying it, Olivia. Either way, I'll post it later. But it might be kind of nice to finish it up tonight. There's some really lovely chapters ahead that I'm having trouble putting down. So what do you think? What do you think if we go on? Do you feel like sticking around for another half hour, 40 minutes? And if not, we might go on anyways. And you can always go ahead and check it out on YouTube or on my Facebook or on my Instagram TV later on. Bit prefer tomorrow? Okay. If we have enough of you who prefer tomorrow, then we'll just do it tomorrow. So far, 1. So far, you're the majority vote, Alex. All right, I'll give that like 30 seconds. Because it is a long time if you don't have other things going on. All right, well, that's what we'll do. Well, we'll do tomorrow then. We will finish up tomorrow because we have only 26 pages left. So we should be done in just about an hour tomorrow. And we have some of my favorite chapters coming at the end. So, thank you for joining me. Tune in tomorrow at 8:30 Mountain Daylight Time or Mountain Standard Time, whichever it happens to be. In the meantime, stay safe, stay healthy, and I will see you tomorrow.